Hi class, today's video lesson is going to be talking about elements of plot. Now, I know you know what plot means, however, sometimes we confuse what makes up the different elements. So to review the elements, we have the exposition, which is the beginning, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then lastly, we have the resolution. So what I want to go over is what you can keep in mind to know which parts of the story you're looking at as you read a text. So the first part, we have the exposition here. Now, like I said, the exposition is the beginning, but you're introduced to certain things in the exposition, like the setting, so the when and the where of the story, the main character or characters, which could be the protagonist, the good guy, and the antagonist, which is the bad guy. And then you also have the narrative hook. Now, the narrative hook is what we call being introduced to the conflict. Now, the conflict is then what drives the story along. People love a juicy story, so the conflict makes it that much better. So as we get introduced to the conflict, we move up the plot mountain. Now, we can have many different types of conflicts. We can have man versus something or someone. So it could be man versus another man. It could be man versus a machine. It just depends on what the author wanted to do. So the conflict drives the plot, and then that's when the rising action starts happening because things are starting to happen and move throughout the story. So in the rising action, you have the protagonist, remember the good guy, or the main character, who tries to solve some type of conflict. But while he or she is trying to solve that conflict, he or she might face different problems, maybe smaller obstacles along the way. But that's what keeps the plot moving, this conflict. So then as the action starts to build, then we finally reach the climax. Now, the climax, the way I want you to remember it is that it's this turning point. Remember, it's a turning point. It's not always the most exciting part of the story, but it is a turning point because there's a major change that happens. And the major change is that the protagonist, the main character, faces the conflict for the final time. And when he or she faces this conflict for the final time, we see how is the conflict going to be resolved? Is it going to be a happy, positive ending, or is it going to be a bad, negative ending for that main character? Okay, so once we have this major change that happens, then the action starts to die down a little bit. So because it goes down, that's why we go down the plot mountain. And then that takes us to the falling action. So the falling action's job is the main character's response to the climax. So, for example, maybe the main character wants to try to make things better with another character. Maybe he apologizes for what he did, so he's working his way towards a positive ending. However, maybe the falling action is that the main character doesn't think he did anything wrong and all of his friends are leaving him. They're not talking to him anymore. So then it leads to a negative ending. But again, it's the response to this climax, this major turning point that happened. So then we continue going down to the ending. So once we get to the very bottom of the plot mountain, we've reached the resolution. And in the resolution, this is also known as the conclusion, everything is tied together and it explains how the conflict is ended. So again, was it a positive ending? Was it a negative ending? What happened to our main characters? And that's the elements of plot.